Good evening and welcome to Cooperative Vermont. We're coming to you live from VCAM Studios this Sunday, December 2nd, 2012. I'm Matthew Kropp.
And I'm Eric Davis.
And we've got a pretty packed agenda for folks this evening. Before we dig into that, I think might want to introduce our guest. Do you want to?
Sure. It's our pleasure to have Brian Kelly in the studio today. He's a graduate fellow at the Gunn Institute and a member of the Post-Growth Institute.
Thanks for having me on.
Do you want to talk maybe before we jump into the news a little bit about kind of your interest and connection to co-ops?
Sure. So I would say that I'm definitely on the beginning of a learning curve in the co-op movement. So definitely just my excitement is that it's kind of the basis of the next economy. So I was living in Philadelphia for about 8 or 9 years, and so there's really interesting models that folks have developed over the last few decades. And so I'm just really excited to kind of know more about how things are going to develop here in Vermont and how that gets going.
I think it's a great segue into the new economy conference that's coming up this Friday, which it's December 7th, which Matt, and you'll be attending, and Brian, you'll be attending as well?
Mm-hmm. Sure. Actually, quite a few people I've been hearing. I'm really excited. The format's something I've never attended before, but it's, I guess, something called open format, I think. In which,
open space.
Or open space, yeah. In which there's no kind of preset agenda other than some sort of vague ideas, but really anyone who comes is empowered to sort of set agenda items and then have kind of free-form breakouts in which anyone interested in discussing the proposed agenda item can just kind of like organically cluster with the discussion they want to be part of. And so we've been talking and spreading the word amongst people in the cooperative community about kind of trying to get a bunch of cooperators there and have a few breakouts to talk about what we think are the next steps for kind of building a coordinated cooperative movement. And some ideas have been thrown out for different topics. And I think there's going to be multiple breakouts you can so it's not you have to commit to one thing or another. Yeah. But one thing that's been discussed is the idea of doing one on what needs could be met cooperatively in Vermont that aren't. So kind of identifying opportunities for various people who are either feeling entrepreneurial or people who are involved in kind of the financing of startup cooperatives to see what connections can be made there.
Right on.
And I know Don Jameson of the Vermont Employee Ownership Center said he's coming. Don Schramm, there's so many Dons in the cooperative movement in Vermont, it's bizarre. But Don Schramm, who's involved in a lot of co-op stuff, was on the board of City Market when he moved to the downtown location. He was on the show last episode talking about the attempt to turn Burlington Telecom into a consumer cooperative. He said he's definitely going, so there should be a good mix of voices there kind of talking the future of the cooperative movement.
Right. I talked with a couple of people this week that were excited to hear about the cooperative breakout, especially that were already planning on going to the conference. So should be.
Yeah, and it's only $25, and I believe that includes lunch. So
it does.
It's pretty reasonable for an all-day.
I think that if the early birds got to include lunch, so that was Friday was the deadline for.
So
if you register this week, then you do not get lunch. They might have changed that, but last I checked. And I think the keynote is Ellen Brown, who's big in the public banking movement, and so there's a kind of an interest in that democratic control of the monetary system here in Vermont and how we can do that. So.
Yeah, that should be a really interesting conversation to have. As someone who kind of is, I always find myself kind of on 90% of agreement with public banking people, but I'm always just but they should do it through credit unions that are outside of the state and, more autonomous. But I think there could be some really interesting conversations about
definitely. I think
what that structure could look like potentially.
Yeah, I think that would actually be a really great kind of component in this format because you can kind of appeal to these different, like you were talking about, the structure can really evolve. And so if folks who are involved in the credit union movement could come and be like, hey, how would public banking affect the credit union movement here in Vermont? Are there ways we can leverage the current situation of credit unions to actually, we already have a lot of the infrastructure, and use that to move forward with that.
Mm-hmm. So if you're watching at home and would be interested in joining us at this New Economy Conference, you can either go online, just type Vermont New Economy Conference into Google, and you should be able to find it. Or there's also on the Cooperative Vermont Facebook page. There's an event for it, so you can RSVP if you'd like to be part of the co-op breakouts as well, specifically, but just in general, if you're going to the conference and want to connect with other co-operators.
But RSVP on the Facebook page is not necessarily registration for
Yes.
the event, right? So
Very true, very true. There's a link on that Facebook page to the registration page,
Right.
so make sure you do that and pay your $25 or they're going to turn you away at the door. But that actually brings this kind of a segue from there into Rebecca Dunn, sort of, if we're going to be having discussions about the funding of co-ops and, okay, where are these cooperative needs that are not being met, probably the most active, high-profile sort of source of capital for the cooperative movement, in New England at least, is the Cooperative Fund of New England. And their director, Rebecca Dunn, who I've had the fortune of meeting a few times at different conferences, and she's always seemed pretty sharp, was just inducted into the Cooperative Hall of Fame, which is exciting.
Yeah.
And I don't know if they're going to be having a presence at the New Economy Conference, but I know they've been to other co-op focused events, and City Market both has received loans from them and now has several $100,000 invested with them. And they've helped finance, I think, the Brattleboro Food Co-op expansion. They've helped
nice.
finance some startup stuff. I think actually once it kind of gets going, the new food co-op that's kind of in the organizing phase in Barrie will probably be getting some capital from them. So they're a really interesting organization, and for people out there watching who want to sort of put their investment money where their mouth is, you're not going to get rich. I think it's like an investment there pays like 2% interest or something. But
You can choose actually anywhere between 0 and 2%.
Mhm.
You choose your own interest rate and sort of some of the terms that go along with your investment.
right, but good karma and building a better society for you to live in later. So I figure that's a good return as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and so then when we talk about those returns, those are like the private returns for your particular money, but the social returns on those types of investments far outweigh those private concerns. And so as we think about building the cooperative movement, I think it's important for us to think about those ways that the investment in the cooperative sector and like what you guys are trying to do with Cooperative Vermont and like the connections of cooperatives is really going to have a multiplied factor. Multiplied factor is the wrong word. Like a larger impact kind of going forward, and that social impact is really going to be great.
It's a good point. It's a great point, actually.
Yeah, and I think that there's definitely it's really interesting. There's only like I think 2 or 3 funds, like the Cooperative Fund of New England. There's one in New England. There's one in kind of the north, like the Midwest Plain states, like Minnesota, Wisconsin, kind of the Dakotas. But I think, and then there's one more I think, but there's really sort of these sources of capital for co-ops are really explicitly for co-ops are really few and far between, and it's kind of we're fortunate as a region to have this sort of this resource in place that I think has played a big part in the fact that like places like I think Vermont has like more food co-ops per capita than any other state in the country, and other things like that. Like when you have that kind of institutional structure that can support this sort of growth, it really, really helps.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, and then another sort of speaking of sort of the cooperative fund money was part of the, we talked about this last episode, but the recently finished renovation at the Brattleboro Food Co-op that, I don't know if you follow this, but they both built this very energy efficient new building, but then also built, was it condominiums or apartments?
That's apartment style housing, 24 units.
Mm-hmm. That are owned through the land trust as
Nice.
affordable housing. So it's kind of this really cool mixture of cooperative models in kind of one space. And they actually just were just recognized by the Environmental Protection Agency for with an award kind of for their building. So that's kind of another checkbox for the
Yeah, I think
food co-op movement.
there were 47 or so cooperatives that in the running for that, and they're one of 3 that were chosen for that award. So
Very cool.
Mm.
So does the land trust owns the Brattleboro Food Co-op as well, or the land?
Just
they own
the
the land
housing
on
units
Oh, just the
above-
housing units. Okay,
above.
cool.
Yeah, I believe, and I could be wrong, but I believe it's the food co-op itself owns the building.
Gotcha.
Or I think it might even be split ownership, in which the sort of the apartment units are owned as kind of like owned by the trust, but the store part is owned by the co-op.
Right on.
And another bit of food co-op news, the city market has been talking for a while. I know I've been in at least 2 fender benders in the city market parking lot. And I know of many other people who have as well. The last time I was in one, I remember actually both of us just got out of the car. It was 1 mile an hour just backing into each other. Looked at the cars, there was no damage. We were both driving like beater cars. And we were just like, city market parking lot, got back in our cars and drove off. Like, there was no even tension. It was just sort of this fatalism that, city market I think does, at their last annual meeting, something like 3 times many dollars of business per square foot as a conventional grocery store. Like something that's just like insane, like how much more. And so like they're sort of bursting at the seams in terms of like the membership is up to 8,000, and it was like they're doing like almost, I think, like $35 or $40 million a year in sales. Like,
Better problem than the other one.
Yeah.
The opposite problem.
But so one, they've been talking for at least a year now, I think, about possibly trying to open a second store.
And a bigger space, I think, is what they're focusing on.
From what I'd heard, it was like, at least initially, the idea was to do kind of like a neighborhood-sized store, so it would be like a smaller store, but like in an area where a lot of them, there's like a concentration of members, so that it would like hopefully draw off some of that business, so it would reduce the busyness of the downtown parking lot, because you would have another store to go to.
Right on.
And so there'd been a lot of talk about the south end, and Fresh Market just closed, and so there's some speculation about that means the south end has even less food choices, so that would be another opening. But I guess they've been having a hard time finding sort of a new space in the south end to go into. So recently, kind of there's an announcement, I think it was in a 7 Days article, that they're now starting to think about, okay, well, if we can't find a space in the south end, either moving to the north end of Burlington or like the old north end of Burlington, or Winooski as the other potential spots for a new city market, second city market store.
Yeah. And in more food co-op news, there's some folks in Bennington that are trying to spearhead a food cooperative in that community, the Selshire Community Market. So if you're in the Bennington area and you want to get involved in starting a co-op, get in touch with those folks through our Facebook page.
Yeah, it seems like there's really kind of this uptick in food co-op organizing. One of the interesting things about having Don Schramm on last week was he has this like deep. He's been involved in the co-op movement since like at least the 70s, if not before. So there's this like deep reservoir of experience, and in our conversation, I heard a lot of sort of mention of these co-ops that don't exist anymore. So it seems like we've gone through. There's like this burst of founding them, like up in St. Albans, the Rail City Market, I think was it?
Yeah, that sounds right.
Which actually ended up going from being a food co-op to being a sole proprietorship. So the food co-op essentially sold to one person who's just like, I'd like to buy it, and they decided to demutualize essentially. But so there seems to have been this like period of like food co-op decline, and now suddenly we've got, what was it, Granite City Grocery in Barrie, one going in Bennington. There's actually I found Facebook pages recently, or I heard about it a while ago, but talk of Morrisville as well. So that's at least 3.
Yeah.
And then City Market's opening another store. It really seems to be they seem to be on the move right now, which is, I think from my perspective of promoting co-ops, a pretty positive thing.
Absolutely.
But yeah, in terms of, where there are new food co-ops popping up all over the place. The credit union movement is another story.
Yeah. Well, the credit union movement's also gone through a sort of cycle where interest in credit union membership has picked up especially over the last 2 years or so, the bank transfer day. But the number of credit unions has sort of been declining as credit unions try to reach sort of economies of scale and so forth.
And so one credit union that was just closed, Border Lodge.
Yeah, the Border Lodge Credit Union in Derby Line. Yeah.
So it was, do you know any of the background story behind that? Was it?
There's not a lot of not many details out at the moment on sort of what brought about it was a state chartered credit union, and the state just sort of ordered it to be liquidated as just over $3 million in assets. And so the NCUA is handling the liquidation, but there's not a lot of details out there right now. They were concerned with what they saw in their financials.
And to put that in context, like the major credit unions you see around Burlington, like the Vermont State Employees, I think is around $500 million in assets. The Vermont Federal is like around 250, 300 million range?
Around 350 or so.
350, okay. Yeah, so these are like hundreds of millions of dollar institutions, whereas this...
This institution also had one salaried staff member. So,
okay.
Where those other organizations that you were mentioning have a sort of ample professional staff.
Mm-hmm. And this is kind of part of a larger trend within the credit union movement since I think it was 1969. The number of the size of the credit union movement, if measured in number of institutions, peaked and has been sort of on a steady decline since then. And it's kind of coincided with professionalization of staff and heading towards looking for economies of scale in terms of size. But it's sort of interesting also because you have this sort of transition from, you mentioned there was one paid staff member. So these institutions that were more community based and relied upon volunteer work a lot more than something like, say, Vermont Federal, where you're a board member, where you have a volunteer board of directors, you have a volunteer supervisory committee, but the amount of work done by the board of directors versus the amount of work done by paid staff, there's a lot more work done by paid staff, where in a place like Border Lodge, you're going to have an opposite burden of work, probably.
Sure.
So it's definitely the character of these kinds of organizations are fundamentally different.
Absolutely, and the credit unions have become more and more regulated, so there's a lot of sort of compliance issues that makes it more challenging for a small credit union to really exist.
I mean, that could be an interesting interview to have, would be to maybe see if we could, if there's not legal issues, if this is just sort of like a, if there's, obviously if there are legal issues, people are not going to be talking about it, but if it's just sort of kind of a artifact of this trend, it might be interesting to get someone from their board to come in and talk about that trend and talk about, what it's like to be a small credit union in a world in which that's increasingly seen as an anachronism.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I found it interesting the way that you framed it, just kind of talking about the volunteer labor that kind of used to be a big part of these smaller credit unions. And so I'm wondering, I haven't done any research on this or anything like that, but kind of the stagnant wages over the last few decades and the kind of less free time that people have to be able to be active parts of things like their local credit union and the cooperative, and being able to give that volunteer time. I'm just wondering kind of if there is some sort of correlation with those two things.
Well, one thing that I think is kind of interesting that I encountered this when I was in graduate school. I did my work on credit unions, and particularly my degree was in history, so I did some oral histories. And there was this one woman who was the very first treasurer, paid employee of a credit union. The Chittenden County College Employees Credit Union was founded in the 1960s, and the first couple of years she wasn't paid. She did all the work out of the proverbial shoebox. I think it was maybe had a lock on it, maybe. And about 3 years in, the board couldn't do much, but they voted to pay her $100 as a token for her services, with a recognition that it wasn't enough to fully compensate her, but they felt that they should give her something. And she took the $100 check, signed it over, and donated it to the credit union. And so like I had found that in the minutes, and I ended up finding her. Like she was still alive. She was the I think longest or second longest employee at in UVM's history. She had like out of high school gone straight from like her typing class. The teacher of her typing class in high school was like, oh, my husband works in the like agricultural economics department, and they need a new administrative assistant, or a typist. So like she went straight from high school to become a typist there, and just worked continuously in the same department as it had like maybe four name changes from like 1943 or 44 to like 1990. Like she officially retired in like 94, 95, and then like kept coming back into the office for a few years after that because like no one else like knew everything, how everything worked as well as she did. But I sat down with her with a video camera. I actually still have the video kicking around somewhere, but that would be an interesting thing to maybe show at some point. But did a little oral history, and like when I like pressed her on that, I was like, why, when they offered you this money, why didn't you take it? And her response was along the lines of, well, being part of the credit union was kind of helping people. Like, and it was framed in terms of that sort of civic mindedness. Like this is something you did as a service to your community, and like to be paid for that for doing kind of the service work. And she was kind of Catholic, so kind of coming out of that I think perspective as well, as sort of seeing like having sort of service be an integral part of like her religious tradition. I think that was present as well. But there's definitely a lot of that. If you look kind of at the earlier volunteer-based credit unionism, a lot of this it was almost comical. They finally got her to accept like an attaché case when she like left the position as like a final like, we need to give you something that because it was a gift that wasn't money, she couldn't give it back.
Yeah.
But like, and so when like small credit unions like this close, it always makes me think, what was that culture like? What was, how much does that reflect the same experience that that this woman went through, Yvonne Grattan, and how much does it how much has that changed even for small credit unions now? Like, is their experience fundamentally different than it was 50 years ago? So, interesting questions being brought up. But one fewer credit union in Vermont now. And then I guess the last thing we have on the agenda for cooperative related news before we get into some more detailed conversation, some of the things that you're bringing to the table this evening, is CrapeGate.
Yeah.
If you are not on Twitter and following obnoxious local issues, CrapeGate is something that kind of came to the fore recently. There's a contract was up for the for being food concessioner at the airport, which is owned by the city of Burlington. And the winning bid was from the Skinny Pancake, which has the restaurant in downtown, and the same owner also owns the Chubby Muffin, which is in the Old North End. So there'll be both a Chubby Muffin and two Skinny Pancake locations in the new in the airport. But what really sort of stirred up the controversy was that the Skinny Pancake was given an exemption to Burlington's livable wage ordinance, which says basically everyone who contracts with the city has to pay their employees what's considered a livable wage, which is like 13 something an hour if you include benefits, and without benefits like 17 something an hour. And this has been framed as kind of by, there's been people who have been back and forth on this issue, sort of. Some people have been framing it as kind of an attack on the livable wage ordinance. Other people are saying, well, this is kind of like, this is an appropriate exception because this is a business that uses a lot of local foods, local products, really sort of supporting the local economy, does a lot of socially responsible things for a company versus someone like Dunkin' Donuts, which said that they wouldn't meet the livable wage ordinance, but sourcing lower quality GMO, all the things you don't want in your food. So it's been a really interesting discussion that's been gone on publicly around it. Do you guys have any thoughts on that before we jump into the cooperative connection?
Just quickly, do you know if you mentioned a competing bid there? Did they actually say that they would meet the living wage ordinance?
Yeah.
'Cause the way I understood it is that all the competitors made 2 bids with the living wage ordinance, and one with the living wage ordinance, one without the living wage ordinance.
My information is only from the Burlington Free Press article,
Okay.
which talked about the other companies actually saying that they put the bid in with the living wage ordinance as well, but then Skinny Pancake in theirs would say we can't meet that requirement. If you're going to have us there, then we would need an exemption.
Yeah, I think it was there were 4 different organizations bidding for it, and I think it was 2 said that they would meet it, and then two would asked for exemptions, and Skinny Pancake is one of the 2 that asked for an exemption.
Okay.
But so, in the kind of damage control around this, the owner of the Skinny Pancake took to his Facebook page and made and basically sort of was answering people's questions and concerns as they posted them. And so actually there's another event that's coming up that is the Vermont Employee Ownership Centers. They're doing a workshop on business succession. So, rather than like giving your business to your children or selling your business to a corporation, selling it to the employees, and kind of the different models how to do it. The workshop's actually this coming Wednesday, December 5th, at the Gardner Supply in Burlington, which is an employee-owned company through an employee stock ownership plan. So I posted that to the Facebook page, and the owner responded saying, actually have sort of, employee ownership is my pie-in-the-sky exit plan. There's clearly a problem with socially responsible exit plans when you see how Ben & Jerry's sold to Unilever. Since we were privately held, we have the ability to do this. Because Ben & Jerry's was publicly held, they had to act in the interest of the shareholders. There are a lot of things that are not in the financial interest of the shareholders, donating 1% of their sales to environmental nonprofits, go to the airport with lesser margins and higher costs because of the local foods mission. We also act much more quickly because we do not need permission from many people in decisions, which helps us grow the biz. But ultimately, the greatest way to keep it local would be to sell back to our employees. I don't expect to do this for a decade or more, but it's on my radar as an idealistic way to exit. So thanks for sharing. So I felt like that was an interesting response and perhaps one way of addressing the concerns about the Skinny Pancake being essentially used to undermine the livable wage ordinance. But do you guys have thoughts on this?
Just a sort of a general thought that it's sort of a sad commentary on where American workers are, that we need to have a livable wage ordinance in the first place. That the majority of businesses wouldn't realize that they're paying their workers a livable wage doesn't actually help their bottom line by having a more productive workforce. And so I think that in itself is just a huge sort of thing to tackle.
Yeah, I mean, this situation, it reminds me of something we were talking about a little bit earlier before the show started, about my experience in Philadelphia working with the Carpenters Union. And it was a similar idea where the idea of wages or creating a minimum wage is very rooted in this kind of old model of an economy, right? It's rooted in this idea that like there is an owning class, there are owners of businesses, and then there's kind of like a workforce that then they kind of pay what the minimum that they can, and that the government steps in to kind of care after if there's any abuses or kind of if the compensation is just deemed too low. But the idea of wages is that it's rooted in the antagonism of this kind of working class and this ownership class. And so I think that what you brought up was really right on point, which is if we're thinking about the new economy, if we're thinking about moving forward and building a sustainable Vermont, this is the exact thing this is a changing of the conversation. Right now, the conversation is sitting inside of the livable wage. It's an old paradigm to have the talk. It's saying, all right, well, workers should be getting X amount because that's the that's a minimum standard of living that we deem is good because we're a socially progressive state like Vermont. Still an old discussion. What you guys are talking about here is great, which is saying we actually want to be talking about how to remove ourselves from this false kind of binary between workers and owners and actually create workers into owners and see how they can align incentives in the right way. So I think it's great. And so I realized I didn't actually link back to the labor unions. But so what was always interesting to me is that in a lot of the trades unions, the unions themselves are the ones that manage the pension funds. So a lot of the workers, as they work, then kind of pay into those pension funds, and that's invested. But then the leadership of the union is negotiating for the terms of all of the big developments with the large-scale developers in the city in Philadelphia. So in one side, they have this big pot of money that's getting invested somewhere, and then in their daily practice, they're sitting there negotiating for like that little extra wage that they can get for their members. And so then thinking about it in this new paradigm would be, well, we have this pot of money, developers are investing in the city. What if we are the developers and we invest in the city and then we pay ourselves a living wage that we think is appropriate, but then we kind of align our incentives such that we are actually getting the full kind of benefit of our work. Mm-hmm. Full compensation. So I just think that's right on scale with thinking forwardly. So nice post on the Facebook.
Well, one other thing that I think that this sort of brought up for me is within the cooperative movement. I think one of the when you have a going concern, oftentimes co-ops have these well documented business literature advantages over other forms of ownership, because you're really sort of bringing people sort of wider bases of people in who have a real literal investment in the success of the firm. It's like if your actions, if you're just being paid a wage, if you work a little bit harder, a little bit less hard, you're not going to be rewarded more or less. But if you're, have a sense that okay, if I have an idea and instead of just sitting on it or just being oh that would be good, but it would be a pain to bring it up and I wouldn't be compensated for it. If it's oh this will make you're an employee and this will make the business more efficient, then there's no reason not to. You make the business more efficient and everyone in the concern benefits. But sort of one of the issues that I think the cooperative movement has in terms of its expansion is there's sort of this entrepreneurship problem, where if a single person starts a cooperative business, it can, you can do it kind of altruistically, but it's oftentimes a few individuals taking a lot of risk and then people coming on later who can buy in for the equal amount. Same, it's sort of a relatively small buy-in, but then can benefit from its existence without having borne the same amount of risk. And so I think this skinny pancake example offers a really interesting opportunity for kind of a model of cooperative ownership in which, unlike a lot of kind of socialist models, you don't completely eliminate the idea of the individual entrepreneur taking risk and then getting a reward for it, but rather sort of creating a norm around a different path of succession, where right now the entrepreneurial dream is that, okay, I start a business, it gets really good, and then a corporation comes in and offers me $50 million to buy my idea. I take the money and hurrah, I've won America. But kind of creating this other model, perhaps more meaningful model of, you have this idea, you start it, you bring other people in, and then you sell to your workers as your exit, and then maybe even instead of just selling to them and leaving, you sort of share ownership and become part of this community that you value. You create a workspace and a project that you find valuable. You decide to join it as a peer rather than, and then you get compensated for the risk that you took being the entrepreneur with kind of a one-time sort of payout when the workers buy it from you, but then and then you could potentially use that if you're just an entrepreneurial person who likes starting new things to start your next one. But I think that's an interesting model for building the cooperative economy that sort of has a place for both kind of individual initiative and collective effort. And I think that, if the owner of Skinny Pancake does follow this path that he's outlined, he could be kind of blazing a trail and creating a model that other people could follow.
For sure.
Aren't at the moment simply because of lack of imagination or lack of an idea that can't be done.
And one idea with that is to actually tier that in over time. So especially okay, you put all of this sweat equity into building this company, into kind of creating Skinny Pancake into the image that it has. Thinking about just giving it to the workers in one fell swoop is oftentimes a blow, because the Skinny Pancake is then part of an identity, the company that's created is part of the identity of the entrepreneur. So that as workers kind of phase in over time, so it's okay, you've worked there 1 year, then you have the ability to have a 0.5% ownership or 1%. It depends how big we're talking about. But then for each year that a person is there, being able to scale that in so that instead of having to work at all the legal stuff in 1 year, you talk about a 10-year phase-out plan where that person can kind of continue to have that larger share. So we don't have to think about co-ops as everybody has 25%. There's 4 people, and great. And if the owner, it starts off and it's like, oh, it's employee owned, but there's pieces that you gradually increase with. There's a few folks that are doing that with coffee shops, actually. A guy I met last June who's got a coffee shop out actually in the Midwest, and my buddy down in Philadelphia. And that's his plan, is he wanted to start a coffee shop, so he's got a vegan coffee shop in South Philly. The Grindcore House, it's a really amazing place for anybody that goes to Philadelphia. You can like them on Facebook as well. But his long-term plan is to figure out how do you turn that over to workers. And he's really been trying to think actively about that. And so really looking for resources, because there isn't really that, that resource for owners who want to think about another transition plan.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're really lucky in Vermont to have the Vermont Employee Ownership Center here as a resource source for people to sort of tap into. But yeah, and I think Don Jamieson again will be at the Vermont New Employee or New Economy Conference that's coming up on Friday, and hopefully we'll be having him on the show in the next few months. We're actually, our schedule's starting to get pretty booked, which is a good thing, but you know.
Where that conference is happening too, at Gardner Supply. I mean, that's a place where that's actually happened. You know, it's not a cooperative; it's an employee stock ownership plan, but where the founder did sell that to his workers.
Yeah, and there's a couple of like fairly major Vermont companies that have done that. Let's see, King Arthur Flour is employee owned, and what was it? There's one other that I'm trying to remember. There's a company that grinds lenses. That's like does some like really high end kind of like engineering of like creating like scientific lenses for scientific instruments in Vermont, like Spectra or something like that. But I know that they also sold to their employees as an ESOP. So
Don Schramm's company as well, Data Systems.
Yeah. So it's there's a good mix and a good number of organizations that have done it. So it's not an entirely uncharted path, but nonetheless, it's still, I think, it's still one of those models that is that's much less known about and used than others, and I think a lot just there needs to be a lot of educational work around that to get people thinking about that's a possibility. But yeah, and I think also it's like it's not just education for owners of businesses, but for employees as well, because. One of the things I think that the cooperative movement struggles with, and this is something that goes beyond worker co-ops, this is something that's true in all co-ops, is that like the dominant institutions of our society socialize people to certain roles. And so, for instance, in the case of a credit union or a bank, people will go in, or a food co-op versus a grocery store. People are socialized in banks and grocery stores to be customers. And customer has like all of this kind of array of this array of behaviors and like attitudes that you sort of expect as a customer. You're oppositional to the person you're buying from. You're each trying to get the best deal. There's all these things that are just kind of you're socialized into. It's like starting as a young child and going right along. You bring that with you into adulthood. And then when you go into a credit union or a food co-op, and suddenly it's like, wait, I own this place. I don't actually have to be in an oppositional relationship. If City Market makes a profit off of what I spend there, I get a check at the end of the year. That changes the relationship, but I think it takes even if you're interested in co-ops, it can take a while to get used to what that really means, because it's so tempting to simply fall back on the schemas, the sort of models that you were taught, and that are the ones that are kind of usual and expected in society. And I think it's the same thing with sort of an employee versus a member, kind of a member owner. It takes a little while for someone to move from the relationships and the power dynamics and all of those things that are inherent to being an employee into this role of kind of collaborative owner who also works there. And you're going to behave, once you understand what your incentives are and sort of what the culture is, like you're going to behave differently. And again, the research shows that employee-owned firms tend to perform better than traditionally owned firms because of that. But there's this transition where people have to actually relearn a whole new way of being.
That's true. That's important.
So I think that the skinny pancake will be definitely on our radar going forward, and seeing how this progresses. So I think that pretty much wraps up what we've got for the co-op news. But I was thinking we could talk a little bit about kind of your experiences and interests in terms of the cooperative movement and your work with the Gund Institute and post growth and all that. So do you want to talk a little bit about kind of your work and what brings you to be interested in this sort of stuff?
Sure. I think first though, when you're talking about early on when you're talking about the City Market parking lot, one of the conversations we were having before we started was this idea of like growth opportunities for co-ops, like where are there kind of edges. And I think we get to think big and small around things like that. So even something like, okay, there's congestion in the parking lot, we should build a bigger parking lot or get a bigger space. That's one solution, but then tied to my work with the Gund Institute is looking at, well, actually encouraging more kind of private vehicle usage isn't necessarily the best thing if we're looking at kind of the long-term sustainability in the world. And so you have examples here like the pedal co-op, which mostly does stuff with around, if I'm familiar with it, is mostly with compost. Mm-hmm. But even thinking of grocery delivery services, where you could go and shop and not have to bring your car and know that your groceries are going to get to your house. And it could be a cooperative, you know what I mean? Just like mm-hmm. extensions of something like that, where we get to think on like those small scales, but then also kind of the big ones in this larger context of like a sustainable Vermont and what that's going to mean.
You're having member workers riding around bikes with trailers to deliver people's groceries.
Sure, why not?
Why not?
I mean, for me, I do not have the panniers necessary to, I think that's what those are called mm-hmm. On my bike. But I often go in there and I'm like, I'm just gonna get a few things this time, but then like the food should taste good, chips are on sale, suddenly I gotta get like 4 bags of them, and then I cannot fit everything, so it's a real awkward ride home. That would be a great service as far as I'm concerned. Because I don't have a vehicle. But then even for folks that do have vehicles, it's kind of this idea that, oh, wait, I need it because I'm going to buy too much groceries to bring on my bike. Mm-hmm. Well, then you can have something like that. So that was just kind of a side based on our conversation earlier. But I think kind of our conversation up to now probably kind of has demonstrated what my interest in is in this kind of alternative economy where we're going forward and kind of aligning incentives. So what you were just talking about kind of how worker-owned, worker cooperatives specifically actually have a higher success rate, or kind of it's this aligning of incentives for like looking at workplace conflict, where if I'm just an employee, I'm just kind of like, oh, this boss is getting over on me, and the kind of like all of the ways that you kind of take from the company or something like that, where they always talk about is like, how do you solve this problem? And this is like a
5-finger discount. Yeah.
But so just in that realm, one of the examples I had come across kind of years ago, and like I think that was my first introduction to worker-owned cooperatives, was the Mondragon example in Spain. And so this is dating myself about 10 years now when I was like first looking at it. And so I've never been there or anything like that, so this is not like hands-on information. But just the discussion of this cooperative, where it's just kind of like this community that ended up, okay, well, first we're going to start with this one cooperative, and suddenly it's building into housing cooperatives and credit unions. And so then like everything is actually kind of built out of this model of a community building itself forward. And so I think only 1 out of 80 different cooperatives that they started there failed. And it was like the fishing cooperative, like that was the only one. But that particular model of how do you basically create the incentives for community building inside of it? We have this weird role of like capitalism really kind of rewarding the individualists. So like the more individualist you can think, the more personal reward that you have. And so then we have structures that actually allow that type of behavior to happen. If we're going to move forward, a lot of it is about how do we create structures that promote cooperative behavior. And so that's one of the things I'm like, well, this is a no-brainer. And so then at the Gund Institute is getting involved with kind of larger kind of cooperative structures like the Commons or things like that. Folks know here in Vermont that in 2008, groundwater used to be a private resource, like you owned the house, you owned the water underneath it, and then in 2008, Act 199 turned that into a public trust resource. So it's this kind of general recognition of shared ownership of things. So we can look at it as in the economy, this kind of shared ownership of workplaces and businesses, but then also of our natural environment. So that's one of the kind of pieces that really have inspired me going forward. I don't know if I answered your question, but
No, I think that's a pretty.
It's interesting you brought up the Mondragon. I was reading something today about, ties back into the trade unions, about steelworkers unions collaborating with the Mondragon on establishing cooperative manufacturing places in the U.S. So, thought
Yeah,
that was
no,
really cool.
I think it's Stoughton Lind who was involved actually in. He's written a bunch of. He's kind of a labor organizer. He was involved in an initiative back in, I think it was the 70s, that was sort of inspired by Mondragon a bit. That was this plant. This plant was closing, the steel plant, and this combination of like the workers and the community sort of came together to purchase it. And then I think it ultimately, like, the project ended up failing, but it was kind of an initial inspiration, kind of that experience, and sort of seeing like where the supports were, where the barriers were, has like inspired a lot of the cooperative organizing in America since.
And if I remember correctly, one of the main reasons that failed was actually the labor unions shot it down because of this kind of historical discussion around like workers versus owners, and this was kind of outside of that. So how do you organize when the workers are the owners? It's just like, we can't make that while work. Mm-hmm. And so then like we should really be thinking about that link between how the future of the labor union movement, which is also struggling, can also kind of take this on as part of their strategy for growing in numbers. And I know a few of the different labor unions are doing that. SEIU is a great example of like really trying to say, no, worker cooperatives sound like a great idea. So it looks like that movement's coming around, so there might be some real nice synergies involved.
Sort of knowing that little bit of history that you just threw out, I think makes the whole United Steelworkers kind of Mondragon partnership that was announced last year all the more impressive, because it would it's they've traveled from the point in the 1970s where it was the labor union saying that we don't want this to happen, to them actively partnering with one of the world's largest, if not the largest, worker co-op, and cooperative really complex. There's lots of there's a lot going on there in terms of its ownership structure. But to say like let's actually start putting some resources into trying to see if this can be replicated in the United States is a huge shift.
Big time. I think the most recently, so I haven't studied it much, but the last I heard was that unfortunately, and Mondragon, in order to stay viable in this kind of increasingly globalizing world, and to maintain their kind of internal structures, that they've had some privatization of management and things like that, but they've had to kind of look at being like competing in that globalized world, and so therefore like the what do you call it? So the boundaries that they draw are like, okay, it's our community, we have to figure this out, and then it's us against the world. So then like on a world scene, they're kind of operating like any other kind of international corporation. Mm-hmm. And so then as the cooperative movement kind of grows, is looking at how are we looking at the full range of a supply chain, that kind of, as you were talking earlier about Cooperative Vermont, really looking at all the different parts of the cooperative movement and how do we create synergies between them. Same thing, it's like, okay, well there's these pieces here in Vermont, like are we linking up with cooperatives all along the supply chain to make sure that we can kind of build a kind of international kind of cooperative as like a backbone or foundation of this new economy. Mm-hmm. So.
And this 2012 being the year of cooperatives, there was actually a major conference, I think at the beginning of October, that I had sort of hoped to go to, and then life got in the way. But that was cooperatives from all around the world gathered in Quebec City for a combined sort of, there was a sort of general congress of cooperative movement organizations from all these different countries who came together, and then there was a parallel conference that was a research conference, sort of setting the agenda on what does it mean to study cooperatives, what should we be looking at as going forward. And so I think that sort of coordination is definitely there, and I think this whole 2012 Year of Cooperatives thing has really kind of helped crystallize that idea of looking beyond, kind of where cooperatives are now to like where they should be or could be.
It's exciting time.
Yeah. And I think it's the sort of thing where, that entrepreneurial problem we talked about earlier, it's something that can kind of get in the way of that. And it's like, okay, we have this thing here now, it's running well, but, then where does that initiative, where does the energy come to sort of bring things into the next sector, making the next cooperative happen, or the next piece of the economy to ultimately, there's a great book that came out, I don't know if either of you read it, maybe a year ago, called Humanizing the Economy. Written by a Canadian cooperator that was sort of goes through a number of different examples of cooperatives operating different forms of life, or different parts of life in different parts of the world. But he has a couple of chapters in there that are kind of more theory-oriented that are really, I think, in terms of like recent accessible co-op theory, some of the like most interesting observations I've read in a while. And he has this one kind of image that I really liked, which is that like right now we have these little islands of cooperation in this great sea of capitalism. And his image or his like vision is this sort of idea of inverting that and make it so there's little pools of kind of capitalism, this individualism that's necessary for people to sort of take the initiative on entrepreneurial things, but not having that be the thing that dominates most of life, but having that in its place, doing what it's supposed to do, but sort of recognizing that like having most of the vast majority of the economy be something that's characterized by cooperation and is organized on those lines.
And, go ahead.
We were talking before the show about some of the barriers to that new economy, and I was just wondering if you might talk more about that.
Yeah, that's what I love. So I guess it ties into what you were just talking about when you said, there's a few chapters on theory in this book that like really kind of lay it out. And I'm finishing grad school and I'm kind of like, all right, I'm done theory. Like, all right, I get it. Like, this sounds really great on paper. And I think to kind of speak to this point of like, one of the main things that we need to do is kind of relearn how to cooperate. How do we act like as human beings together, because all of our social structures are so individualized, our wages are individually earned, like we purchase things like for ourselves, like all of the ways that like it's the individual rent that we're paying for like this particular room that I have in the shared apartment. So there's all these ways that we're kind of forgetting how to kind of relate to each other as humans, and even just like the polarization of the political debate. You could kind of argue is this kind of larger way that society is really having discussions. It's like, all right, this is what I believe. This is what I believe. We can't work together. Like a lot of the ways that even just like Congress behaves, you're like, well, that isn't cooperation. That's not modeling anything about cooperation. And so then I think a lot of what we have to kind of relearn is group process. We have to really kind of pay attention to what are the different ranks and privileges that different people bring to a group. And if we're going to come together to run organizations, how are we able to manage those in a way that's going to move us towards the enterprises that we want to build? And I think that's going to be a major part of it, because we can have all the vision and all the theory that we want, but if we don't know how to talk to each other, if we don't know how to like work together in groups. So I think that's going to be a big part of it.
It's a great place. It's a great place where cooperatives sort of provide all this opportunity too, because as a member owner, you're participating in decisions with your other member owners, and you're constantly talking and sort of weighing, what's best for the collective, what's in my interest, and you sort of have all these little democratic institutions occurring all over the place.
And I think it's with the gift that the cooperative movement that are, how'd you describe them, like these little islands inside of a sea of individualism, that's the gift that it gets to kind of give back, to actually like teach the rest, to be like, no, we have done this. Like, it's not like we're creating this from new. So then when I talk, I kind of like, even realizing, just saying like, we have to learn how to do this. Like, there already are those things happening in various places. And the gift to give back is to say, look, it's a model that works. Look over here, replicate it, and as much information as you were talking about before that can go back is just great. In terms of the new economy, my fascination is this way that we can balance the human needs and kind of environmental, I guess I can call it conservation, but just kind of this idea of, we always hear about like climate change, we always hear about this kind of like pending ecological collapse and things like that. but at the same time you're hearing about like unemployment and like the inability of people to just like meet their basic needs. So sustainability has to kind of deal with both of these different things. And one of the ways of doing that, some of the conversations over at the Gun Institute that have been really fun for me in this theory world, but have been based on like, how do we remove ourselves from, say, commodity land, where especially as young folks, like a good portion of our income is going to pay rent. Like, how do we remove ourselves from this commodity labor where we're not owners, we're just kind of like getting this wage for whatever it is, this mindless activity that we're doing, oftentimes to pay back student loans that we incurred. And then also this commodity money, so kind of like the financial crisis that we saw. And so like, how are we kind of decoupling from these like different systems? And so then if we're talking about Vermont, Vermont's a really interesting model of folks that are really interested in that local image. Like there's already a culture of saying like, let's stay local, like how do we invest in Vermont, all of these things. And part of that is to look at what are of those three things that I just listed, like the land, like the wages, and then the money itself, how are we localizing those? So for example, like a community currency is one way of like localizing money. There's all types of, a lot of folks might have been involved with Burlington bread over the years. Like there's a lot of pitfalls for why a community currency like doesn't get the impact that we might want it to get. And one of the reasons is because it's only, the demand isn't there for the currency because you can't purchase enough things with it. I think that one of the big problems was a bottleneck at City Market. City Market's like, oh, and Muddy Waters, they're like, well, we'll collect it, like we'll accept it. And then suddenly they're like, okay, great, how do we spend these? And it's like, we have way too many of these. So there's like these bottlenecks. But if you start having, if you start getting broad-based acceptance of where these can be spent, so for example, for rent payments,
Right.
you have a city ordinance that says, oh, you are allowed to accept up to 10% of your rent as a community currency. Well, that's suddenly changing the game. And so it's just kind of like little initiatives like that where we don't have to think of like the full systems change, but are there windows that we can kind of get in? One way of starting that would be having say a land trust that is able to accept that community currency. We have a great example of the Champlain Valley, is it the Champlain Valley?
Champlain
Housing Land Trust, that's right.
Yeah.
But they have a kind of a very large network of properties, and kind of like that model of really saying we are part of community. And so then it's not about you keeping the private gains of like your wealth. You're part of a community, and that's the benefit of living here. And someone like a Champlain Housing Land Trust being able to say, all right, 10% is going to be in this local currency. Suddenly everyone's going to be like, oh, shoot, how do I earn this local currency? And that would kind of give the third leg, which is these cooperatives. Like, okay, suddenly you have cooperatives popping up saying, all right, we're going to do energy efficient renovations. One of the things being a renter here in Burlington I find abysmal is the way that there's no incentive for any owner to ever make energy efficient improvements on their properties.
Right.
The market is saturated. There will always be young, mostly students, but like young people who are just like, I have to live here. There's not a high vacancy rate. Owners have no reason to fix it up. Then you suddenly have a cooperative that's like, oh, we're going to do energy efficient improvements. Suddenly you start tapping into developers. You do like a public campaign to really say, no, this is the kind of the next generation. So it's almost like a thing of pride to have those properties be energy efficient. And that worker-owned cooperative is like, okay, we're going to accept, X amount of our money in dollars and X amount in this local currency. So suddenly you have this kind of interconnected way that these things can play off each other. So I could really geek out in that.
Well, we've got about a minute left, so
sorry about running over.
If people want to geek out, there will be a great opportunity on Friday at the New Economy Conference where we will all be. But thank you so much for coming on the show, and we will be coming back in 2 weeks with Avram Patt of I believe it's the Vermont Electric Cooperative or Washington Electric Cooperative, one of the electrical cooperatives in Vermont. Very interesting fellow. I think it'll be a really good interview. So until then, I'm Matt Kropp.
And I'm Eric Davis.
Thanks and good night.